Boomers are very concerned about cars getting blocked in a driveway. It's like one of their biggest fears, right?
Yes.
You're blocking me. Hey, it's an emergency.
Yeah.
If you're blocking a car in a driveway, crisis.
Yeah. Where do you need to go? Nowhere, but I might need to later.
Welcome back to
a very special Ami's house.
Yes, I've been enjoying these reaction videos here, these unpacking episodes. I think it's cool to react to what's going on out there. Did you see, first of all, the headlines here of Gavin Newsom starting this podcast?
I saw a reaction to the reaction.
So Gavin Newsom started this podcast. He's had Charlie Kirk on and Steve Bannon. And it's just so funny and rich because it's fairly obvious that he's doing it because he's noticing the popularity of all these conservative commentariat and podcasters, and he's trying to get in on that. Presented as, I think it's time to come together in dialogue. Like, he's doing that for the same reason he does anything, to try to appeal to that base and be popular. He's seeing they're popular, and he's trying to be popular, so he's coming in, and he's letting Charlie Kirk chew him out, and he's saying, that's exactly why we need to have these conversations. And it's just so funny. It's so obvious. If Biden or Harris had won over Trump in 2024, he wouldn't have started this podcast to dialogue with people.
No, I don't think so. And I love the phrase chew him out. It's one of my favorites.
But it's like
it's an obscene phrase.
It's almost like the kidnapper coming in with the kidnapped kid saying, look who I found, and trying to like take the credit for like recovering the bad situation without actually taking responsibility for committing the crime. It's like a very funny posture, and it seems pretty obvious for people.
I actually wish more of that was happening. Like on the day after the election, you thought that everyone was going to be doing that, but it doesn't seem so.
Podcasting, like on the left?
No, just like being like, okay, let's dialogue with everybody. Forget the resistance. Let's do something else this time. But it seems like the resistance is in full swing.
Right, and just doubling down.
So it may be cringe and lame, but I think it's nice he's doing it.
I guess I respect the hustle. Like, he's willing to put Charlie Kirk in the room to chew him out because he knows that's what people want. It's like the motivations and intentions aren't good, but I guess I appreciate the gesture because he's like, hey, this guy wants to be popular so bad, he's going to put himself through the ringer. He's not saying I screwed up. He's saying we need to have these conversations. Right. Like, it's all an obfuscation.
One question before we get into Darryl Cooper on Rogan. How does the governor of California have more time to podcast than you and me do?
I think he's got a lot of time. He had enough time to go out to a restaurant during the height of COVID. Did you know that scandal?
I did. Without a mask. That's the one I know about.
And it's like a way of signaling taking responsibility, but not. It's like, look, we're having these conversations and letting Charlie Kirk say these things at me, but I'm not actually being reflective or introspective. I'm just like, So it's I find it very disingenuous because I find him very obviously disingenuous. But anyway,
it's okay to be disingenuous, just not obviously disingenuous. That's the truth. That's the truth.
Speaking of genuine and disingenuous, Michael, you and I just watched. There's been all of this controversy around the latest
our homework,
the latest slew of Rogan guests. This whole conversation about the woke right, the ascendant, troubling ideas on the right-wing commentariat and things that are happening, and it's been concerning. But we did both watch this episode with Darryl Cooper that had all this controversy. He had been on Tucker Carlson. He was just on Rogan.
Wait, who was he for someone who's not familiar?
So Darryl Cooper has this big history podcast, which he claims not. He says he's not a historian. He's a storyteller. But it's interesting to know that Tucker Carlson said, well, I'm going to say you're the premier historian anyway, which gives you a sense of the theater that we're all watching on social media. And I mean, I'm happy to just give I have so much to say about it.
So just for a second, he has a podcast called Martyr Made. He does these very long Dan Carlin like series. Huge investigations into interesting histories. And he was on Tucker Carlson a few months ago, and Tucker Carlson called him the greatest living historian. And then Darryl Cooper went on to basically explain why someone might be a Nazi and sort of explain why Hitler did what he did, and perhaps it wasn't quite as bad as we all remember it being.
He also did make some irresponsible tweets given his profile and the topics that he's involved in, tweeting a picture of like a the sort of trans display at the Olympics and said, which one's worse, this person or Hitler? Clearly this one's like, so he's done some sloppy things for sure.
So he was called a Hitler apologist.
Nazi apologist.
He was called a Nazi apologist, and Tucker Carlson really blasted him into the stratosphere.
Yeah.
And
he said Churchill was the real villain of World War II. In the Tucker interview, that soundbite went around.
He was that guy questioning whether the narrative about World War II and the Holocaust should be the narrative we talk, or should we take another look at it? And he just went on Rogan, and actually listening to him talk for 3 hours, I walked away with a different understanding of him. I think you did also.
I totally
did. Talk about it.
So you want me to go first? There's a lot to unpack here. I think a couple of things. This sparked a lot of this back and forth in the Twitter sphere between these sort of traditional new conservative media versus woke right, the Dave Smiths and other people who are kind of defending him, Rogan and these people. And I get why there's sensitivity, and we can talk about why there is a sort of heightened sensitivity around Holocaust narratives and anti-Semitism. And all of these things in which the woke right is obsessed with transgression and just saying whatever you want to say. And in a world post-October 7th, the fact that the temperature is very high around potentially speaking about subjects and issues that will be red meat for real anti-Semites out there, I understand why there's a reactionary component, why we're all very concerned and eyebrow-raising about this, because anti-Semites run wild with a lot of this stuff. And there is a lot of bad actors out there perpetuating classic Jewish tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, and stereotypes. But I will say, in principle, you can't really criticize a person or something you haven't watched or consumed. You can create a boogeyman in your head about what that person is. But at the same time, within the first couple of minutes watching, I remember that the far left used to do this to guys like Jordan Peterson and Rogan. They would call them all sorts of things, racists and transphobes and all this stuff. And then if you press them on it, have you watched any of Rogan? No. Have you watched any of Jordan Peterson? No. They saw a clip of Jordan Peterson saying enforced monogamy in a New York Times smear headline. And then they would just come up with they would categorize him a certain way. And I started to get the sense as I'm watching this that okay, Rogan has watched this guy for years, clearly is a fan. I haven't. I don't know. So my judgments are a little bit skewed. And I do trust Rogan after years and years of being a fan, not just because I'm a fan and I'm not making an excuse, but I kind of trust that when he's telling me, no, people are misunderstanding you, given that he has much more exposure to his work than I do, there's a good chance he's right. So I'm watching this and I'm like,
can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
I also watching this, it occurred to me that the most generous reading of Rogan and his project really is for 100, 200 years after I'm dead, people will be able to go back to my podcast and say, hey, you really want to know what this person thought? Mm-hmm. I gave him the opportunity to talk for 4 hours. Mm-hmm. Maybe I didn't push back. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job, whatever. But here's a record of this person not being able to BS for 4 hours. You can agree, disagree, whatever. But I gave him that platform to do that, and no one else really did.
Sure,
and so you can be mad at me for not pushing back or whatever. But now this record stands, and you can make your own judgment from here on out.
But I'm actually giving him even more credit than that in terms of being discerning, because he's not just saying he may be a Nazi apologist, but let's see what he has to say. He's saying, I know he's not, and I understand why you would be concerned if I was having one on. But I'm so familiar with this guy's work that I understand the whole totality of things, and I wouldn't have somebody like that on. I think that was the idea when he said in that opening, I know that things got clipped up and taken out of context, and Tucker introduced you as a historian, and a lot of these historians said, this guy's not a historian. I'm like, he says himself he's not. And my main point is, we're big boys and big girls here. As Jews, as proud Jews, even as Zionists, as being pro-Israel, all of our positions, that I trust Rogan's intentions. And then when he's speaking to this guy, even if he says ideas that are bizarre or troubling, are we so fragile that we can't handle it and respond to it? And at the same time, just to try to get this out as cohesively and as I can, I understand that there's something to be said about the way history is often presented from an educational standpoint is often, in a way, emotionless and very kind of matter of fact and at the same time humanizing so that you can really understand how actual evil comes to fruition, how evil regimes come to power. And Jordan Peterson has lectures all the time across YouTube before he was famous, talking about Hitler, kind of psychoanalyzing Hitler and Stalin and these societies. And and Jordan Peterson had been for years saying, you think you wouldn't have been a Nazi? Yeah, think again. You would have been, and you would have enjoyed it. And we all have this malevolence, like Jordan Peterson exploring malevolence. Because I trust Jordan Peterson's intentions, and enough people do, I don't think it's suspect. And I think when you're listening to this guy, he's sort of taking the same approach. And even though things come across as provocative, I think it's with this goal of understanding things. And I kept going back to, as I'm watching this episode, Jordan Peterson's famous line in an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman, where she said, in the context of a trans debate, why should a trans person's right not to be offended? Like, why should your right to free speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended? And and Jordan Peterson responded, in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. In order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. And that's how we arrive at truth. And that's how we arrive at ideas. So I'm watching this episode. I'm like, well, we have to apply that same standard if we're being if free speech is being tested by the left, as it has for so many years, and now being tested by the right, and even some of the incorrect ideas of the right. I think we're all old enough and mature enough to be able to, like, if Daryl Cooper's wrong about something, then he's wrong. That doesn't necessarily mean he's hateful. And these kind of provocative statements about trying to understand, like, Hitler's motivations or about his love for the German people, I think in a post-October 7th world, in a world that actually does have a lot of real ascendant anti-Semitism, that stuff hits differently and it's more concerning. And that's fair. But to just say Rogan's a Jew hater, this guy's a Nazi apologist, is pretty low resolution. And if you listen to it, my takeaway is, okay, that was interesting. And I think we're all big boys and big girls, and we can contend with that.
Yeah. So and so we both listened to the full episode. I haven't listened to a full Rogan episode in forever.
Yeah.
My Lord.
Yeah.
And yeah, I walked away with interesting questions that I'd like to ask you and discuss with you. And then we're hopefully planning on having, like, a real World War II historian, Holocaust historian on to really dive into some of these, because I agree with you. I haven't engaged since October 7th. I have been fairly afraid to engage with the other side of the conversation because it's so
traumatic.
It's so traumatic, and I think I'm right, and I don't really see the value in engaging. But I did engage with this, and I did walk away with a couple of questions.
And if this episode aired 5 years ago, or Tucker's, there would have been no controversy. Yeah. Like, people would have been like, "Oh, Rogan's got a funky guest on with some cool angles."
Well, so that I think that's one of the points that I think he does miss, which is that which I think a lot of in this big anti-Semitic conversation is missed, that when we're up in arms about anti-Semitism, like you said, the reason it hits harder now than it did 5 years ago is because now we understand in a much more visceral way that there are real consequences to bad ideas getting out there. Where 5 years ago, I think we would have said, like, maybe not. Who really cares? Now we know, and so it does hit in another way. And he himself seems very He said something really interesting where he said, he said he saw some kind of satellite imagery of a Russian tank being blown up by a Ukrainian.
Darryl said this.
Yeah, Darryl said that, and and he said his heart just broke because he's just like, I don't like seeing anybody die. I don't care who they are. I don't like seeing anybody die. And to this point about consequences of anti-Semitic speech, that's an extremely privileged thing to say when you're safe and sound. I don't want to see anybody die. When you're under attack and when things really matter to you, some people do need to die. And so again, he can say anything he wants about anti-Semitism because he's very insulated from the consequences of it. Whereas we don't feel insulated from it. So he's privileged in that way. Like, I can question all these things because at the end of the day, if someone runs with it and does something crazy, who cares? I mean, that would be so sad to see Jews die, like, it doesn't.
Yes, but I think his attempt, it seemed to me, was to be like, I really want people to understand the human cost of violent conflict. It's not just something you could throw it back at us. If I'm playing devil's advocate, I agree with you. But playing devil's advocate, it's like, yeah, we could talk about, some terrorists just have to die and there's collateral damage. And I understand the necessity for that, being closer to an issue than he is, in that sense. But he's also trying to call that side out. Yeah. Don't be so callous and trivial with human life or decisions. But he does make the case overall that history is very messy and sloppy, which I think, in a sense, is an apologist for everybody and an apologist for nobody. That was some of the interesting takeaway. But I'm curious more to your question.
Yeah. So I actually love his point of view. Like, in my own writing, like I have a story where one of the characters is this is basically like Hitler Youth who really wants to fight in the war. He's like, the prototypical Aryan, but his father won't allow him to fight in the war, and like what that does to him and why he wants to fight, and like watching his friends fight, and he's the only guy left in his town. Like, I love thinking empathetically at that level about serial killers. Like, I mean, we have those conversations all the time. You just told me an awful story about, I don't want to get into details, but someone did something very bad, and my response was, "Oh man, I feel so bad for him because like now everybody knows and his life is over." Like, right. I actually love that. I think, though,
and he points that out, like, this understanding brings you very close to empathy, which is why people get very disturbed, right? Rightfully so. So he's pretty explicit about that. So, and I'm just like, we're mature enough to handle it,
right? And so his thing is thinking about what must have been going through Hitler's mind when he made the decisions he did. What must have been going through all these concentration camp guards' minds and Nazis' minds, and like, instead of judging them, sort of being empathetic to them. And I guess I do like that exercise a lot. I think though it's not his job, I suppose, to follow that up. It's other people's jobs to comment on it. But I do think the next step after hearing him say that is a bit of judgment and a bit of accountability, regardless of whether or not you can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, and it's like the context of the world you exist in now in the current state of reality for certain communities kind of matters. But he does kind of admit that people go down this rabbit hole, and before you know it, like the lure of anti-Semitism, he affirms that happens to these people. And Adolf 3.3, whatever, makes some comment. But then when those people have questions, they're smacked down and shut down. And we used to speak about this all the time. In my initial conversations with Candace, one of my justifications for engaging at that level was to try at least sort of this attempt in the school of Darryl Cooper, trying to understand people's minds going astray and getting morally confused about things. So I did make that. I don't think it worked in Candace's case, but I do think like I got some credit from the public for doing that and showing that maybe this is a better approach. Ironically, in Candace's case, it seemed to not work at all. But the point being, like, I'm mature enough to hold my positions and believe what I believe is right, while being able to hear an idea that is very troubling to me. I think he was pretty loose with certain statements, like talking about the violence of the Zionist settler. And when he said, like, now if Hitler had remained in power 10 years and like if he had turned his back on them and backstabbed them, then that'd be a different story. But historically, he did turn his back on them. He met with Neville Chamberlain not to invade what, Czechoslovakia or Sudetenland, and then he did. So that's a historical debate and an argument. I think he also said Hitler was raised in Germany and then moved to Vienna, but I thought Hitler was born in. So again, like, might have had the facts wrong, but that doesn't make him hateful. But there's a responsibility in a way, you could say, given that we're in a heightened temperature, for that the paranoia about Jews isn't fake, and him being and his historical takes might not be fake either. Both could be true.
The part that did bother me is he does seem to lack some sort of understanding. He seems to understand the empathetic part of it. He seems to understand the loving part of it. But he doesn't seem to understand the dark part of it. Like, he had a line where he said, at the end of the day, you can say anything you want about Hitler, but he loved the German people.
No, that's a strange angle.
It's just crazy to say that. Like, he loved Aryans. If you were German but not an Aryan, he did not love you. So it's the imprecision.
It's the imprecision.
It's an imprecision talking about a very big topic where, and then my question for you is, so let's say he's not anti-Semitic, he's just a historian a storyteller who we need to engage with. But under his episode, you get 100,000 viciously anti-Semitic comments. My question to you is so where does that leave him? Like, so Daryl, you're not anti-Semitic, but you are giving, like you said, red meat to vicious anti-Semites. Like, what do you say back to us, Daryl?
Okay. You're asking me?
Yeah. What should he say? Well, how is he what level of accountability should he take personally?
Yeah. The question is this a guilt by association thing? In other words, like the fact that he has certain viewpoints that he presents and the way he presents them attracts this new resonant anti-Semitism that's on the rise and on the ascent. How do you combat that? The response, I'm asking, does the response to him to shut him down and shame him as if he's like noticing the way the anti-Semites present it versus stepping up to the plate, challenging the ideas in the marketplace of ideas? What does more? I'm asking this like I don't have the answer. What does more does it mitigate the anti-Semitism or does it exacerbate it if we react by going into our silos, naming and shaming, writing smear articles versus, well, interesting. Right. Or do we present ourselves as strong, capable, formidable, and we can have these debates and conversations and we're not afraid to?
Right. And I think it might require a different word. Someone who we don't know whether they're anti-Semitic in their heart or not, but is saying inflammatory, objectively anti-Semitic things that are giving red meat to vicious anti-Semites. Cool. Let's not call them an anti-Semite. But like,
it's entirely possible.
What do you call that person?
Yeah, it's entirely possible to not have any animosity towards Jews, but make statements that, like, are because of the Goebbels propaganda and the Holocaust and the events of Jewish history, trauma, and atrocity against Jews. These statements are not in a vacuum. If you perpetuate, the truth is we all speak in generalities about a lot of things. We talk about like that was an interesting part when he talked about, the network of Jews had this network that was transnational. I'm like,
wait, no, he said in the medieval times you had your priests, your aristocracy, your serfs, and then you had your Jews, and they were sort of allowed to run their own cities, and they sort of made their own laws, and they were sort of a different sort of class, which is also like a real misunderstanding. I think like they were relegated to ghettos, and they were the lowest of the low citizens. They weren't like allowed to just do their own thing.
Well, the truth is, if you listen to The Message and The Messenger, if you trust the messenger, if you had some rabbinic scholar or medieval scholar, right, who was very pro-Jewish, that had a history of being pro-Jewish, even while listening to Jordan Peterson talk about history or something like that, and spoke about the Jews as a group generally, and both the shtetl, poor culture, and downtrodden Jews, but also the Rambam, Maimonides, was the assistant to the...
No, but he was talking about medieval...
I'm just saying. I'm not a historian, and I don't have the scholarship to challenge him on direct points.
So say what you say.
My main point is speaking about Jews in terms of generalities historically and the roles Jews played in certain societies. If you trust the messenger, it's much easier to digest the message. And if this was 5 years ago, like the shorthand way in which we talk and educate ourselves and tell each other stories is generalizing and talking about groups. But the problem is there's a lot of talking about Jews as a group with nefarious intentions in today's context. It seems to be everywhere. It seems to be really spreading online, which adds a lot of gasoline and concern to just saying the way the Jews, and whatever it is you're going to say. 5 years ago, pre-October 7th, I could digest that statement and say, yeah, there was we're a unique kind of group. And we always, often as a community, take pride in the things that are generalized about us, but then we hide away when things come at us from a negative standpoint, right? Collectively, we want to decentralize and decollectivize the vices, but we sometimes take pride in the collective accomplishments, right? So I'm just trying to keep us honest here. I get that in the context of rising anti-Semitism, and it's also like you said, these ideas have consequences. The sickest thing is that consequences led to these bad ideas. In other words, October 7th happens, and now we see a rise of it. You would think it'd be the opposite, but in fact, the Jewish state gets attacked, Israelis get kidnapped and slaughtered, and now it's open to just, like, that's a very sick dichotomy and sequence of things. You would think you'd have all these bad ideas and these horrible things, and then it would lead to an October 7th. Turns out the opposite is true. So one has to ask yourself this question. Like Joe Rogan said, I noticed it too. all this anti-Semitism. I'm just like, what? And then he went on to say, but you have to realize that's an overreaction. I don't necessarily think it's an overreaction because there has been this horrible event and this horrible expression of ill will towards Jews. My point is, we also still have to keep in mind that we still are human beings who speak in shorthand and educate each other, talking about groups and history. So his ideas about Jews being transnational, having a network, there is something not conspiratorial about that, but rather just descriptive about the fact that we are a nation and a tribe that has been cast around. And therefore, maybe it's true that the various regimes and stuff were able to work with them. That could narrowly be true. And it's okay to indulge and listen to that. And if it's not true, point out why it isn't without assuming nefarious intentions from him. But I get it. I think there is some sort of like, I would appreciate a little bit of a consciousness to what the comments are saying and that you're giving them something, whether you intend to or not. But that's, I think, something to point out in the marketplace of ideas rather than calling him what his comment section people are.
Well, I mean, him and Rogan have that in common where they just don't take accountability for what happens after they put their pieces of media out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is a choice. I don't really respect it, but it's a choice that they can make. And yeah, I do agree with you. The next step should be engaging with everything he said and putting out rebuttals to it instead of just labeling him an anti-Semite.
I wouldn't engage with everybody, but when I watch him on these shows, I'm like, this guy, he didn't strike me as nefarious. I don't know. Maybe even he
relate
looks
to him.
Yeah. He kind of looks a little Nazi-ish, which is the problem.
He does this thing also where like he talked about Rosa Parks and talked about how when Rosa Parks moved up from the South to the North, she actually felt like she had more dignity in the South because at least people, at least she had like community and a job and I think he talks that she went into Jim Jones's church. That was kind of the ending of the story. And I'm also like, unless you're basing this on Rosa Parks's diaries, you have no idea how Rosa Parks felt. You also have no idea how Hitler felt or anyone in Germany felt in World War II. Like and in that way, you are very much a storyteller. You create characters out of these historical people and put thoughts and give them dialogue and give them feelings, which is not something a historian does. And so,
but he doesn't claim
it's
to
cool.
be.
Yeah, it's really cool to listen to, but you have to remember when you're listening to him, you're listening to a storyteller,
right? And
not a historian. It's really important.
And Rogan tried to give him a softball, like, so when did Hitler start going after Jews? What do you mean by that? I'm like, well, and that was just kind of amusing to me when he's like, well, Mein Kampf, if you take it at its face value, I'm like, it's pretty explicit. And I've seen people challenge his claims that like Hitler was just keeping his Jew hatred stuff to private rallies. I'm like, I think that's an easily debatable and debunkable point. But again, if you respond to an easily debatable and debunkable point with a smear or an ad hominem, that doesn't give your argument more credibility. It makes it seem like you don't have something to say. So I'm just trying to give us credit where it's due to be consistent and say it was for so long the far left and the woke people who couldn't handle ideas that were troubling. I don't think we should succumb to that. And it's not true in every case. If someone is hateful and just saying a bunch of racist, bigoted stuff, I'm not going to go on that podcast or talk to that person. I get weirded out when Dave Smith feels like he can be the Jew that they can like. And maybe he believes truly that he's like a Daryl Davis Jew who can go in just like Daryl Davis converted KKK members by just being likable to not being hateful. Maybe there's a part of Dave Smith that believes that by sitting with someone who's a Fuentes or a Jake Shields, that, they'll come around and realize the error of their ways because I'm cool. But at the end of the day, telling people what they feel in their heart is really unproductive. Judge the statements, combat them. I think we're strong enough intellectually and emotionally as a people to do that. It's frustrating that we have to have these arguments again. It's frustrating and a little sad that, all these old Jewish tropes have to be re-litigated. I'm not saying they all do, but to tell me like, you should just criticize them and debunk their ideas. Some of these people, it's like, you're really telling me, would you ever tell a black person, hey, debate why you're not racially inferior? Or there's all these people saying it. I think you should just step up to the plate and prove why eugenics is wrong and why you're not racially inferior. Like, you could see why that would be hurtful and offensive because I thought we put these horrible ideas of our past to bed, like racism and anti-Semitism. But alas, a lot of them are here. And so we can have to operate with a little bit of discernment. And so when I hear a guy like this on Rogan, it diminishes. I think Rogan made a good point about diminishing, like what Wolpe said, save the term for those who deserve it. And whatever this is, save the term for his comment section pointed out to him, like, this is really happening. And yes, this quest and thirst to understand malevolence, that's just his bag. That's what he likes to, talk about. But for years, Jordan Peterson, who's like a hero of mine, I watched these lectures he would do on Hitler and Stalin and stuff, and he was saying he dedicated decades of his research to understanding malevolence psychologically.
Right.
It is fascinating. But the problem with knowledge and fascinating ideas is that sometimes in the context of a reality where there's a lot of nefarious people responding to it for the wrong reasons, might warrant a call out or a distinction to be made. I would appreciate it, certainly, but
it felt weird. It felt weird when the episode opened to have two non-Jews agree that they are of course, even though the Jews are calling you not anti-Semitic, we both agree you are for sure not anti-Semitic. It
Why
felt
is that troubling?
Because I wish the conversation went a little bit more like, hey, I know you personally, and I know that you're not anti-Semitic, but it seems like a lot of Jews have issues with what you're saying. So let's investigate. Maybe what you said was anti-Semitic if everyone's saying it was.
Except that most of the critics, I'd presume, are not familiar with the work, because Joe Rogan's contention, you have to remember, same with Dave Smith, was if you have listened to this guy in any sort of real way or depth, you could not come to the conclusion.
But I did listen to him, and I have not come to that conclusion necessarily. I don't think it's so clear that what he is or isn't. I don't know. I'm not mad at him. I don't think we should target him. But I listened to him for 3 hours, and
and your takeaway was that he has anti-Semitic.
I'm not saying he is an anti-Semite, but I don't think it's so clear that he's not an anti-Semitic. He's not an anti-Semite. I don't think. I don't know.
My takeaway was that he's certainly not simply a Nazi apologist and an anti-Semite. That's
sure, but I don't think
seems to be that in
thing.
an effort to explore these historical things in a perhaps controversial way, provocative way, stimulating way. It risks providing and fomenting anti-Semitism.
I'll say
that's a negative externality of what he's doing.
Well, sure, and I'll say it in a way that I want to start talking about this. I would say I'll never know whether or not he's an anti-Semite, but I'm not so convinced that the things he's saying are not anti-Semitic. I don't know. Know.
Well, I guess it comes down to, at the end of the day, not what's anti-Semitic and what's not, but what's true and what's not, in a sense. That can sound controversial, but the only thing that really matters when you're talking about history is what's true. Is it
right?
If it's, and I'm being hypothetical, if it's in fact true that Hitler didn't mean Mein Kampf,
well, so
if that's true, and he found out that actually Hitler had this other plan, that's interesting. The fact of the matter is, his whole timing on when the concentration camps were happening, the anti-Semitism that swept across Europe and Poland and Belarus. He's the people were horrified by Kristallnacht. I'm like,
right.
What?
Right.
So you're just this is all should be called out and confronted from an idea standpoint. What I do think is it's not necessarily clear, and I think what Rogan isn't as aware of is your ideas are fomenting it, and it could be because your supporters or the people who like these clips are misunderstanding you, but so are your detractors. Both can be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well said. And I'll update what I said. I don't know if you're an anti-Semite, and I don't know if what you're saying is anti-Semitic, but I think you've told a really interesting story. I'm not sure if any of it's historically accurate.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm not sure you understand Hitler or World War II or the Holocaust.
That might be the most you can say, because everything else is rooted in intention and presuming intentions.
Mm-hmm.
You may have controversial views about, it's the same thing when conservatives used to talk about race and black on black crime, and Ben Shapiro was on Rogan, or Jordan Peterson was talking about feminism and harm, and they would call him a woman hater, a misogynist, a transphobe. And he's like, you just might not understand my ideas. And you have this narrative in your head that there's this rising anti-black racism in the country, or anti-trans and misogyny on the rise. They genuinely believe that. I genuinely believe that wasn't true. The problem is I genuinely, and obviously I'm biased, but I think it's observable that the anti-Semitism case is different, not because Jews are special, but because Jew hatred is much more is real and resonant in a way that's very observable and obvious. Whereas I think I think that historically, like coming up to this point, if you follow the last like decade and a half, like I remember we reached a point where like it felt like racism and tribalism was at like an all-time low where people weren't thinking about it as much. And I say this as someone kind of detached, obviously from an insular community, but it just seemed like it wasn't talked about that much in a post-Obama era sweet spot where like it just wasn't the case where we were talking about Jewish conspiracy or racism. And then I felt like the far left kept wanting it so bad. And on campus, they kept begging for it to be a real problem that eventually they got what they wanted. And now we have it. And it's back in full swing. What I would only say to Joe and this guy is, I just want you to think about the things people can say about Jews in the public square today that 5 years ago would have been deemed by most mainstream and decent people as unconscionable. And maybe it still is, but they can get away with it in a way culturally they just couldn't get away with back then. Not because of cancel culture, but just because of decency. And Kanye posted yesterday with Nick Fuentes wearing a swastika, and everyone's just desensitized to it. And if there had never been a Holocaust or horrible pogroms in history of persecution against Jews, I could say, all right, that's just weird. But the first step in this stage of things is desensitization, delegitimization. Right. And I'll just finish by saying Jordan Peterson did say that in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. But he also told Joe Rogan to his face, things get bad one small step at a time. And all these things are incremental. Right. And before you know it, we've arrived at a place where Jews are in real danger. Right. Be mindful of that.
What I would follow that up with is something Javier Rettegor says really well, which is that the story of the Holocaust could really be told as a story of collaboration, where when the Nazis went into a city or a country and the local population did not collaborate with them, they either didn't kill the Jews or had a very, very, very difficult time doing it. Like in Bulgaria, for instance, like the Jews of Sofia in Bulgaria. Right. And so the lesson there is, well, how do you get people a few countries away from Germany to collaborate in killing the Jews? And that starts with smart people thinking they have good ideas about what's moral and what's right and what's wrong. And I think what we understand that non-Jews or people less familiar with the history of the Holocaust don't understand is that collaborating with the Nazis starts with just being able to wear a swastika out and not feel any social pressure not to do that.
Yeah.
I want someone to explain that in a way that I can't explain it, but I think it's important.
Right. I think Constantine had a really good point on this, Kissen, where he was talking to Winston Marshall on his podcast, and he just said, like, basically, like, the left for so long was obsessed with control and cancellation and saying you can't say this, you can't say that, and speech control. And now the woke right is obsessed with transgression. So they just want to say whatever they want to say. It's very reactionary, whether they mean it, whether they don't mean it. And under that umbrella of people just being provocateurs, saying what you can't say, what can't you say now at a sensitive time post October 7th with the Jewish community? I'm just going to keep poking that beast. And under that umbrella are a lot of people who are hateful and dangerous kind of sneaking in there. And so at the end of the day, what's the prescription? What's the solution? I think you have to be discerning, and you have to use the term with weight and with intention. If you're going to call something anti-Semitic, if you're going to call an idea anti-Semitic, a person anti-Semitic, like, we can't lose sight of being discerning here and lose sight of our intellect and our ability to contend with these ideas, even if they're troubling, without losing sight of the broader cultural and societal context in which we're having these conversations.
One thing I do think is worth mentioning as we wrap up this conversation is what you opened with, where he said before he went on Tucker's show, where Tucker introduced him as the most important historian working today, he went to dinner with him and he told Tucker, I'm not a historian. And Tucker, just to repeat what you said, Tucker looked at him and went, yeah, I know, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I think he said Tucker's really great at courting controversy. That was the phrase Darryl Cooper said. And it's just worth remembering that and thinking about that and pointing that out, that like that was theater that we watched.
Right. And like, I'm also convinced, having done this stuff and been on podcasts and whatnot, like, nothing on the internet is as it seems. Everything is presented to you like, hypothetically, had he said, I don't know, I'm not quoting him on this episode, but when you see a clip, when you see something out of context, when you see something edited, like him saying, and that's what allowed him to love the German people. And you go, huh? And granted, there was a ton of traditional, real anti-Semitism in him and that evil hate. Like, what comes before, what comes after can change how you perceive something and what somebody says. Like, it would have been different had he, if he said like such statement and then it cuts off versus the statement before or after can coat how you view the middle. It's a balance. Yeah. So you have to be wary before you jump and criticize something before you understand the entirety of it. And I'm down for the debate to watch people challenge a lot of his ideas and things like that. I don't know if he does do debates. I'm down to see Joe Rogan have Victor Davis Hanson on his show to rehash this conversation and talk about it. I don't think Joe Rogan's the enemy. I'm a fan, and I think he's done such good, and I think his intentions are good, and there's a trust I have in his like commitment to at least being authentic and having integrity. And I will say that he's sort of a cultural mirror as to what the common man is feeling about something. So if he's feeling a certain way about something, that's important to recognize. If you're trying to get a certain message out or a certain set of ideas that you're trying to be persuasive about something that you truly believe, it doesn't seem to be like you have to recognize those shortfalls. You watch Bill Burr's special where he says, he does the whole joke about Gaza and he's like, human shields are talking about human shields. You punch it through a baby, It wasn't a bad joke, actually, in terms of how it was crafted. But clearly the person not attached to these issues or close to these issues is getting a certain perception. And we have to contend with that as a community, as people who care about Israel and the ideas that we're trying to get out there. Like, this is where the chips fall. And you can't fault the people on the other side of it receiving your ideas for not receiving them to your liking. It's kind of incumbent on all of us to get the ideas out with more clarity.
And I'd like to have someone on this show to really do that and start having that conversation if no one else is going to do it.
And I think that's our plan, to try to get some historians and some people on to start. We've tried the approach of like just ignoring some of these bad actors. It's lasted long enough, but unfortunately they've metastasized, and it seems like these ideas have found mainstream platforms. You're seeing Candace on Theo Von and Ian Carroll on Rogan last week and stuff, but that just tells you something. Like, going off into the corner, I don't know if that's going to do it. I think we're strong enough as a community to face it and fight it. It's unfortunate that we have to, and that's unfortunate. It'd be nice if everyone was like, oh yeah, no, this is, but you can see why we could take for granted issues that you're closer to, and trying to identify every anti-Semite and call them out will make us feel good, and sometimes it's necessary. But I'm not saying it ever is as an exercise, but there's also a necessary exercise in engagement with the ideas, lest you seem like you're, giving into the caricature and stereotype they're painting you as. Yeah.
You excited for March Madness?
Hell yeah. I heard that's a Jewish conspiracy. Why do you think they do it in March? It's after their holiday of Purim, and they want all the non-Jews to go mad. That's my Jake Shields impression. Why do you think they do that? They're trying to control all these black athletes to like just go mad. That's why they call it madness.
Can I pitch you something?
Yeah.
One of these guys, someone says happy birthday to them, and they go, I was told it was my birthday. I don't know. Never seen my birth certificate. That's what the doctor told me. I actually tried finding the actual doctor who gave birth to me. I can't tell you I was ever even born.
And I'm not even going to tell you what ethnicity the doctor was. Who was a Jewish doctor?
As far as I know, I'm 12 years old. That's all I know.
That's good. You've been seeing my other ones, the parodies.
I have been.
That's good. I was told my birthday. Like Jake Shields at his birthday party or Rosarian. How do I even know? Maybe I'm 14.
Right. What, the government issued me a document and I'm supposed to just take it at face value?
This is the government controlling us, telling us how old we are? I mean, there's nothing more intrusive than that.
And by the way, whose calendar is it? Gregorian?
Whatever. You could say, like, I'm actually 7. I was like, well, you think like one,
Nice. All right,
Michael. I feel like I got that out.
Yeah.
That was good.
Should have a cigarette.
I think the podcast's worth watching. I think Rogan, I hate the term ally because it was co-opted by the left, but he's not our enemy. I think he does on the whole, like, I'm curious to see how, like, the Jordan Petersons and sort of the conservative commentariat that made a whole brand on being to engage with difficult ideas and being able to think and risk being offensive will eventually tackle these problems. I think there's conversations to be had in those spaces on how to do a better job at doing it. So I look forward to that.
Cool.
All right.
Am
Yisrael Chai.